The creek ran dry in May. That had never happened before. Not in 70 years of records kept by the Vega family. Not in the driest summers. Not in the years the wells ran low. The Seco Creek had always run, thin and patient and certain, exactly like the family that had farmed along its banks for 4 generations. When it stopped, Elena Vega called the county water office. They told her the levels were consistent with regional drought patterns. She had lived through every drought in the last 50 years. This was not drought. The new ranch hand had been working her neighbor's fence line when the creek went dry. He saw her standing at the empty bank with her hands at her sides, looking at limestone that should have been underwater. His dog was already moving toward the creek before Marcus said a word. He had learned a long time ago not to stop Duke when the dog found a direction. What Duke found in the dry creek bed that morning was not natural. And what it would unravel before the week was over would reach further than any of them expected. Some things run underground for a long time before a dog pulls them into the light. Marcus Cole had served 18 years in the United States Army, the last 12 of them with the 10th Special Forces Group. He had worked in places that didn't appear on standard maps and done things that would never appear on any record a civilian could access. He was 52 years old. Solidly built, the kind of muscle that came from work rather than gyms. His skin was brown and weathered from years outdoors. His hair was dark with gray coming in at the sides, cut short as a habit he had never bothered to break. His eyes were dark and steady, and the kind of steady that did not come from ease. He had left the army 4 years ago on his own terms. No ceremony requested. No formal farewell. He had handed in his equipment, signed the last papers, and driven south into Texas without a specific destination. He had found Del Rio County the same way he found most things, by following something in front of him rather than looking for a map. The work at the Haverford Ranch had been available, the foreman had been willing to hire a man who showed up at dawn and did not require explanations, and Del Rio County was the kind of country Marcus found himself able to breathe in. Big sky. Long distances. Land that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. Duke had come from a different place entirely. He had been a military working dog on a base in Germany, retired early after a training injury that had healed better than the veterinary report suggested it would. Marcus had been leaving the base the same week Duke was being processed out. The handler who had worked with Duke for 3 years told Marcus the dog was the best he had ever trained. He asked Marcus if he wanted him. Marcus had looked at Duke for a long time. Duke had looked back with the particular patience of a dog who already knows the answer and is simply waiting for the human to arrive at it. They had been together for 4 years. Duke worked the fence lines with Marcus, slept across the door of whatever room Marcus was in, and spent his evenings pressed against Marcus's leg in the particular way that made the evenings quieter. On the bad nights, the ones where the work in those unmapped places came back with the specific clarity of things that had actually happened, Duke would not leave his side. He did not bark. He did not pace. He simply stayed and breathed steadily, and Marcus followed the sound of it back to the present. Del Rio County had a particular quality that Marcus had identified early and kept to himself. It was exactly the kind of place where one man with money and connections and no one willing to push back could run things as he pleased for a very long time without anyone from outside noticing. Clay Dunmore had been that man for 20 years. Marcus had known about men like Clay Dunmore since before the army. He had learned in the army how to wait. The Vega farm sat on 112 acres along the south bank of Seco Creek. The Vega family had farmed it since Marcus's great-grandmother had been alive. Pecans, cattle, kitchen garden that fed half the neighbors in dry years. The creek was everything. Elena Vega ran it alone since her husband passed. Her son helped on weekends when he could leave his job in San Antonio. The rest of the time it was Elena and the land and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had promised herself and 4 generations of family that the land would still be there. Marcus had nodded to her across fence lines for 3 months before they spoke. He repaired a section of her fence one morning without being asked, and she brought him coffee and didn't thank him for the fence, just handed him the coffee and stood there drinking her own and looking at the hills. He understood that kind of language. It was a Wednesday in late May when the creek went dry. Marcus was working a fence line on the Haverford property that ran parallel to Elena's north boundary. He saw her walking down the slope toward the creek bank, and something in her walk made him stop his work. Duke was already looking in her direction. He crossed the fence line without asking permission from himself. By the time he reached Elena, she was standing at the edge of the creek bed. The limestone bottom was bare and pale in the morning sun. A thin dark line of mud ran down the center where the water had been the day before. Elena said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "In 1956 we had drought so bad the cattle died." Creek still ran. Marcus looked at the creek bed. Then he looked upstream, west, toward the far ridge where Clay Dunmore's land began. Duke walked down into the dry creek bed. He moved along the center of it, nose working low, moving slowly upstream. He stopped 30 feet from where Marcus and Elena stood, sniffed deeply at a section of the bank, then began to dig. Not scattered, exploratory digging. The focused, deliberate kind. Marcus climbed down into the creek bed and crouched beside him. The soil at the bank was disturbed, recently, within days. He could see the difference in the color of the turned earth. He used his hands to clear what Duke had started. 6 inches down, his fingers found a section of heavy black plastic pipe. New. Not drought. Someone had rerouted the creek. Marcus didn't say anything to Elena right away. He smoothed the earth back over what he had found, noted the location precisely, and helped Elena back up the bank. He said he would like to walk the creek line upstream if she didn't mind. She said, "I will come with you." Duke moved ahead of them along the dry creek bed, working the edges methodically. He was good at this, the patient systematic sweep Marcus had watched him apply to a dozen different kinds of terrain over 4 years. The dog moved as if he already knew where he was going and was simply confirming what he suspected. It took 2 hours to reach the point where the water had been diverted. 300 yards inside Clay Dunmore's property line, not near the boundary, well inside, a concrete structure had been built into the creek bank. Recent. Well engineered. Designed to divert the flow underground into a collection system that fed, from what Marcus could read from the pipe outlet he found on the far side of the ridge, a new irrigation system serving Dunmore's expanded pecan orchards. The entire infrastructure was new. Built in the last 6 months. Elena looked at it for a long time without speaking. She said, "He bought the ridge land 2 years ago. I wondered what for." Marcus pulled out a small camera he kept in his jacket. He documented everything, the concrete structure, the pipe outlet, the GPS coordinates he recorded on his phone, the relationship between the diversion point and the property line. He had done this kind of work before, in conditions considerably less comfortable than a Texas creek bed in May. The next morning, he drove to the county seat. Duke rode in the passenger seat and watched the road. At the County Water Authority, the clerk told Marcus that any water diversion required a permit and an environmental impact filing. Marcus asked to see the Dunmore property permits. The clerk spent 20 minutes looking. There were no permits on file. Marcus thanked her and drove to the county commissioner's office. A different clerk there told him the commissioner was unavailable. Marcus asked when he would be available. The clerk said she would leave a message. In the parking lot, Marcus sat with Duke for a few minutes. He said, "Somebody called ahead." Duke looked at him with amber eyes that did not require elaboration. That evening, Marcus was eating at the small diner in Del Rio when Clay Dunmore came in with 2 men Marcus recognized as his ranch managers. Dunmore saw Marcus and came directly to his table, which was not a thing people generally did with Marcus. Dunmore sat down across from him without being asked. He had the wide easy smile of a man who had never been told no by anyone with the power to make it stick. He said he'd heard Marcus had been out walking the creek line. He said he hoped Marcus wasn't picking up bad habits from that old woman's complaint about her water. Marcus said he was just enjoying the landscape. Dunmore said Del Rio was a good county to be in, if a man kept to his business and didn't create problems for people who had been here a long time. He smiled when he said it. Duke was sitting at Marcus's left side under the table. Marcus felt the dog's weight shift, a very small adjustment in position. Duke was watching Dunmore without making a sound. Marcus said he appreciated the advice. Dunmore looked at Duke. Said the dog was a fine-looking animal. Marcus said he agreed. Dunmore left. His two managers followed without having eaten anything. Marcus sat for a while after they left, watching the door. 3 days later, the Haverford foreman told Marcus his services were no longer needed. He looked uncomfortable saying it. He didn't meet Marcus's eyes. Marcus nodded and collected his pay. He drove to the small rental cabin he had been living in at the edge of town. He sat on the porch steps with Duke while the Texas evening cooled around them. Duke leaned against his leg. Marcus called Elena. She had received a letter that afternoon. From a lawyer. Offering to purchase her property at a figure that was half its value, with a note that drought conditions in the region were unlikely to improve and that holding agricultural land in the current water environment was a significant financial risk. She read it to him over the phone without her voice changing. When she finished, she said, "My grandfather built the first house on that land with his own hands." Marcus said, "I know." He said he needed 3 more days. The State Water Authority in Austin had a reporting mechanism for illegal diversions. Marcus had found it on his laptop the night after the diner. The form required documentation. He had documentation. He submitted it that night with the photographs, the GPS coordinates, the timeline he had constructed from Elena's account of when the creek changed, and the county permit records showing no application had been filed. He also sent a copy to a state environmental journalist in San Antonio whose work he had found through 2 hours of searching. The journalist had covered water rights in South Texas before. She responded within 4 hours. On the 3rd day, while Marcus was sitting on the cabin porch with Duke at 5 in the morning, a pickup truck came up the road fast and stopped hard in the gravel. 2 of Dunmore's men got out. Duke stood immediately. He moved from the step to the ground in front of Marcus without a sound, placing himself between Marcus and the 2 men approaching. His body was low and wide and his amber eyes did not blink. The men stopped walking. Marcus stood up slowly. The larger of the 2 men said Dunmore wanted to know what Marcus had filed with the state. Marcus said that was between him and the state. The man said Dunmore could make things difficult for Marcus in Del Rio County. Marcus looked at them for a moment. He said, "Dunmore can try." Duke did not growl. He did not move. He simply remained exactly where he was, between Marcus and what was in front of him. The 2 men looked at the dog for a long moment. Then they looked at Marcus. Something in his posture, the particular stillness of a man trained for a long time in dangerous environments, communicated something the 2 men processed without putting it into words. They got back in the truck and left. Marcus watched them go. He sat back down. Duke came and pressed against his leg. Marcus said, "Good." 2 days later, the State Water Authority sent an investigator to Del Rio County. She was a compact, direct woman who drove a state truck and carried a water testing kit and did not appear to be interested in anyone's comfort. She followed Marcus's documentation to the diversion point. She filed her own report at the site. She documented everything the law required her to document. Clay Dunmore's lawyer called the county commissioner 3 times that afternoon. The commissioner, who was suddenly aware that a state investigator had photographs of an illegal water diversion on file with the state, did not call back. The cease and desist order came within the week. The water began moving in the creek bed 3 days after the concrete diversion structure was dismantled under state supervision. Elena called Marcus the morning the water came back. She said, "Come look." The creek was running shallow but steady when Marcus arrived. A thin clear line of water over pale limestone, moving south the way it always had. Elena was standing at the bank. She did not say anything for a while. Marcus stood beside her. Duke walked down into the water and stood in the middle of the creek, looking downstream with amber eyes, the water shallow around his paws. Elena said, "He'll face the charges." Marcus said the state filing had triggered a broader audit of Dunmore's water permits across the county. There were 3 other properties whose water had been affected. The legal process would take time. Elena said she had time. She looked at Duke standing in the creek. She said, "Your dog found what the lawyers would have taken years to find." Marcus said Duke had found what was there to be found. The water had never stopped being there. It had just been moved. Elena nodded. She understood that kind of distinction. She asked Marcus what he was going to do now that he didn't have work at the Haverford Ranch. Marcus looked at her property. The pecan trees. The cattle visible on the far hill. The house that her grandfather had built with his hands. He said he knew how to fix fence. Elena looked at him for a moment with dark eyes that had been patient for 4 generations. She said, "I know you do." Duke came out of the creek and shook the water from his coat. He came to Marcus and leaned against his leg, looking up. Marcus rested his hand on Duke's head. For the first time in 4 years, he was not between places. Marcus and Duke remind us of something that runs underneath every story like a creek beneath dry ground. The truth does not disappear just because someone covers it up. Duke didn't find a diversion pipe because he was trained to find pipes. He found it because he was paying attention when everyone else had accepted what they were told. That is what loyalty does, it keeps watching when the people around it have stopped. Marcus didn't act because he had a legal obligation or a personal stake in the Vega land. He acted because he saw something wrong being done to someone who couldn't stop it alone, and he had the skills to help. That's all it ever takes. If this story stayed with you today, drop an amen in the comments. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that one person paying attention can change what happens to everyone around them. Subscribe, because we have more stories like this one every week. God bless you. And God bless the ones who keep watching.